What's good, everybody? It's your boy Big Nate. Welcome back to Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews. And today we are here to talk about a very special book to me, The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. So this is going to end up becoming sort of a larger discussion, in my opinion, just kind of about mythology and its relation to dreams and the unconscious and science and technology and all these different spirituality, right? We're going to talk about a ton of different aspects of mythology, and these are ideas that I've been thinking about for a long time now at this point, and so this is gonna be a book review for The Hero with a Thousand Faces, but I am gonna draw on some other texts and sort of, like I said, make it a larger discussion about all these different things. But this is still a book review of sorts, so today we are reviewing The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. I would be remiss if we didn't spark the doobie for bro. And because this is for Joseph Campbell, we smoking extra fat. So if you got your doobie at home, come on, man, you already know what to do. We finna spark this. And without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so while I'm sparking the doobie, we can go ahead and just give a little bit of background, a little bit of lore around this book. So this book was published in 1949. So at this point, it's actually kind of old. But as I was doing the research into this book, I was surprised to find out sort of like the amount of influence that this book has had. I knew it was Joseph Campbell was a popular name, and this is sort of his magnum opus. So I knew there would be some influence, but as I was going into this, like I said, I was surprised to see some of the names that popped up. So, and I think it's going to become clear once we start talking about this book, why it's been so influential. But anyway, just to drop some few names. So right off the bat is George Lucas, who has explicitly mentioned The Hero with a Thousand Faces as being an influence for the Star Wars series. Hold up. I'm resuscitating. Hold on. I think we got him, doctor. I think we got him. Anyway, so George Lucas has explicitly mentioned this book as being an influence for the Star Wars films. And in fact, The Power of Myth, which is sort of the earlier book, which I've talked about, his more popular one, which was a series of interviews with him and Bill Moyers. That was actually, they did that whole interview series on the Luke Skywalker Ranch, which George Lucas let them use. So much of an influence JC had on bro. So that's sick right off the bat. Stanley Kubrick, who is the director of movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Shining, A Clockwork Orange, Doctor Strangelove, huge name obviously in film. He liked this book so much that in the making of 2001, he put Arthur C. Clarke onto it. And Arthur C. Clarke is the one who wrote the book about which 2001 was based off. So bro put bro on to Joseph Campbell. Stanley Kubrick did, so that's crazy. Another name who I was less familiar with, but it makes sense. His name is Christopher Vogler, and apparently he was like a big time producer and screenwriter in Hollywood. And literally, he sent out in a memo that went out to all the Disney screenwriters, basically making this book assigned reading, as saying it was a guide. Everybody needs to read it, and that it should be a guide for the screenwriters. So it's been said to have an influence on movies like The Lion King, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, and I don't know, probably a number of other Disney movies. So like I said, this book has had a huge influence in music. Jim Morrison of The Doors cited as an influence. Bob Dylan, of all people, The Grateful Dead, and in fact, Joseph Campbell and the members of The Grateful Dead actually participated. They like co-hosted a seminar together. So again, bro, the thread of Joseph Campbell runs deep. He's inspired authors like Neil Gaiman, Richard Adams. You know, the list really goes on. So if you're more interested, check out the Wikipedia page. But that's all to say that this book has had a tremendous cultural influence. Oh yeah, the Time magazine in 2011 also named it basically one of the top 100 books of the century. And yet I feel like this book is actually kind of slept on. I don't think it's a super popular book necessarily, but I'm hoping that we can talk about that and maybe interest you to check out some of his work. So what this book is about, right? The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I'm just gonna generally, in like broad strokes here, I think this book is about mythology and all the different aspects of it. So there's the universal nature of mythology, the fact that these same stories keep popping up all around the world. There's mythology as spirituality. There's mythology in the relation to dreams and the unconscious and psychoanalysis. The role of mythology in the modern world, right? The list. So just all these different elements of essentially mythology, and like there's a lot that's going to be encompassed in that, and then that's basically what we can get right into. But what I think the first point I guess to do is like introduce, like how does Joseph Campbell actually introduce the idea of mythology and what it actually is. So basically, Joseph Campbell defines mythology as the opening through which all the religions and philosophies and all of the arts and the very social forms of human society and discoveries in science and technology, he says, even the very dreams which blister our sleep. Mythology is the opening through which all of these actually emerge, and he calls mythology what he says is they're spontaneous productions of the psyche, and we're gonna like get into that. But partly that has to do with the fact that we, again, and this is how we're gonna kind of lead into the discussion, and this is what kind of has hooked me more so, like, and this is what hooked me into mythology just in general, is the universal nature of these stories that are popping up all around the world, all throughout history. And he says whether it be a witch doctor or the mystic sonnets of Lao Tzu or an Eskimo fairy tale, it will always be the one marvelously constant yet ever shape-shifting story. And honestly, I feel like the best way to get into this is just literally to start giving some examples. So my go-to example is basically one of the most popular myths, like mythological motifs around the world. It's basically like the flood myth or the world deluge. And most of us will be familiar with like the most popular version of this, which is the Judeo-Christian version, where God basically is becomes so appalled at the moral corruption of the world that he goes down to Noah, who's sort of like, I guess in some way like a chosen one, and tells Noah and his family to build this ark and to collect a male and a female of every species. And then what happens is God floods the earth. Noah builds the ark, he floods the earth, after which, right, it emerges cleansed and fertile and sort of renewed. And Moses and his fam, basically, and all the animals, they just repopulate the earth. And right, that's generally how the flood myth goes. That's found in Genesis, one of the first and most popular stories of the Bible. Pause. I forgot I had coffee. Okay, so I forgot I had coffee, so I had to get it. I made it specifically for this. So let me take a little sip break. I had it in a French press though, so I'm afraid it brewed for too long, but no, it's good. It's good. But okay, anyway, so I was just giving the example of the Christian conception of the flood myth. So there's a less popular version, and I've just been reading this in one of the actual books. I've talked about it at some point at a book haul, me getting this, but I found there's like actually several flood myths in the Native American traditions. And doing some more research, it is one of the, as far as I can tell, one of the oldest, most ancient stories from these Native American cultures. And it's just something to point out now is, if I'm not mistaken, right, these are the same stories that are found all throughout the world. And the two examples I just gave are the Christian version of it, and I'm pretty sure Christianity emerged in the Middle East. I just kind of found that out in Judea or Israel. Correct me if I'm wrong. But basically in a completely other quarter of the world than, for instance, the Native American indigenous Indians. And then right here's the whole thing. This is how their flood myth goes. And of course, there's going to be variations on this depending on the tribe. But what happens essentially is that God, because this is something that Joseph Campbell says, each culture, they have their own cultural inflections. It's the same story, but cultural inflections. And that comes out because rather than God, their conception of it is known as sort of the Great Spirit. So the Great Spirit goes down, and rather than going down to Noah, and again, it's going to depend on which version you read of this, but they go down to a Native American tribe, right? And basically, once again, it's the same cause too. That's what's so fascinating, is that the Great Spirit is appalled at the moral corruption. Oftentimes it becomes a physical sort of deformity where they become like titans or giants. That's how it is in the Bible version of it. But yeah, similar thing here. They become like these titan beings, which is, the parallels are crazy. We'll talk about that in a second. So what happens is the Great Spirit goes down to one of the tribes, and they basically, for the same reasons, say to build, right, rather than an ark though, what happens is the Great Spirit has them build a giant canoe, right? That's the cultural inflection. So rather than an ark, it's this canoe. But once again, the story is the same. The Great Spirit now floods the earth, and from this canoe, this tribe, they're able to have the world be reborn anew and cleansed again of that moral corruption. So here we basically have, again, the same fundamental story, just with, as Joseph Campbell says, their own cultural inflections. And then in fact, we can further push this to the ancient Greek version myth. So now we have, again, a completely different quarter of the world, and we have, in this case, it's sort of the story of Deucalion's flood. And what happens is Zeus, again, it's crazy the parallels here, for the same reasons. He's appalled at the corruption of mortals, and there's specifically this event where somebody, I think, sacrifices like a young beautiful boy to Zeus, and like I said, Zeus is just appalled at this. He's so appalled that he says he's going to end the Bronze Age, and he's going to flood the earth. So that's exactly what happens. So Zeus, right, rather than God, rather than the Great Spirit, Zeus goes down to not Noah, not a Native American tribe, but to, what's his name, Deucalion. And he goes to Deucalion and he instructs him and his wife to build not an ark, not a canoe, but a chest, right? A giant chest into which they take refuge. After which Zeus floods the earth, and it's from these two, right? Pyrrha, it's Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, and they create the next generation of humanity, and once again the earth is born anew. Then there's the Norse version of it, right? So let's travel now to a completely different corner of the world. The Norse mythology basically has a similar story, which is related to Ragnarok, which is like sort of this huge battle. Basically, it ends in the earth being scorched, completely scorched and submerged in the primordial waters, right? So it's this sort of flood myth in that sense. Everything is devastated, annihilated. It's starting new, right? It's starting completely from scratch. Except what happens is the earth reemerges, and as it does, it's already fertile and lush with plants. But what happened was there were two humans, Lif and Lifthorcir, who hidden themselves in the world tree, Yggdrasil. So again, you have like what ends up being this, and it's from those two that the world is repopulated and the whole cycle begins again. And there's an Indian version of this, like that is to say like the Hindu. What happens is basically, again, it's the same concepts, but Lord Vishnu goes up to this man named Manu and he tells him to collect all the grains of the earth and all the animals, right? And then you have, again, fundamentally the same story. So now we have, right, the ancient Greek, the Judeo-Christian, the Native American, the Indian Hindus. So what you have basically is all, again, in every quarter of the world, you have the same fundamental story being told. And this is what Joseph Campbell means by the spontaneous productions of the psyche, right? This is almost not even happening consciously. This is what Carl Jung is going to go on to argue is what's a manifestation. Myths are basically the manifestations of the collective unconscious, right? Because this is happening all across the world, across culture. It's just something fundamental to what it is to be human or how humans think. But we'll get into all that in a bit. But I want to give another example of just these sort of the way in which all these cultures converge on the same story. So the next one I'll talk about is like basically, I don't know what to call it except like the theft of fire. And this is more so stuff that I found in like my own readings. I don't know how much he talks about it specifically in The Hero with a Thousand Faces. But what I noticed is just at some point, always with the creation of fire, like the advent of fire to like human beings, there ends up being some element of theft towards it. So like the most popular example is probably the ancient Greek version with Prometheus, who I believe is the creator of mankind and like the god of fire. But he's sort of this trickster figure that's always trying to get one up on the gods in order to benefit humanity. And he does all types of stuff. But one of the things is, I believe he goes to Mount Olympus and essentially behind the backs of the gods. And I don't know the exact story, but if it's anything like the Odyssey or the Iliad, right, it's this whole elaborate plan. But to steal the fire, and he steals the fire and bestows it, brings it back to mankind. And Prometheus famously suffered the punishment. I don't know if it was for this or something else or just everything in general, but he's chained to a cliff and an eagle eats out his liver every single night. And because he's a god, it regenerates at night, and this is his eternal punishment. And the Greeks are actually sad because then you got Sisyphus, who like rolls the boulder up for eternity all the way up the mountain and brings it back down. And then there's Atlas, who has to like carry the world on his shoulder. The Greeks knew ancient Greeks knew their punishment. But anyway, the point is that Prometheus goes and he steals this fire before he brings it back to mankind. So again, reading my Native American mythology, what I found is there's something, again, very similar, but again, they have their own cultural inflections. So what happens is all the animals get together, right? There's bear and there's beaver and there's chickadee and there's skunk, right? There's all these different animals. And they essentially just hatch this plan because they know like the sky people, right? The so-called, which I guess would be almost equivalent to like angels or something like that. But they know that they have like this celestial fire and they want it for themselves to keep warm and like cook food and just do all the good stuff that fire does. So they eventually hatch like this whole plan where they build a ladder to the sky people, and then Eagle distracts them, basically gets them to come out to try and hunt him, and then Beaver runs up and he steals the fire and he hides it under his fingernails, and there's this whole chase scene and he runs down, and then he bestows, then at that point now the world has been blessed and bestowed with fire. And Beaver even says he hid the fire in the wood. So anytime now that you have wood, you have the potential for fire. So that's, again, it's different than the Prometheus story, but it in some way involves that element of theft. And then the African version of the myth goes, it's also rather different in fact, but again has that same piece to it, where it's this man who one day while he's hunting, actually it's like this crazy series of events where there's like this magical bird that he follows and he sort of gets lost and eventually stumbles upon fire. But in this case, fire is actually like a deity that you can like speak to. And so basically he gives him the lowdown, and it's basically like, you know, you can use me to cook your food and keep you warm and give you light and this, that, and the other, but the one condition is I must stay here. Like, you can bring whatever you want to me, but I must remain in this spot. And that works for the man, but eventually what happens is there's some people in his village who end up spying on him, and when the original man falls asleep, You have the village spy who comes out, and then what do you know? It's this theft, right? He has to wait till he's asleep, and he goes and he steals the fire, and he doesn't know how fire works, so it ends up burning him, and he starts like this huge fire, forest fire, which burns down all the villages and stuff. But after which, since they sort of paid that price, they learn to have a harmonious relationship with fire. So again, though, you have this element of theft, like fire is brought down to humans by way of some sort of godly theft. And Joseph Campbell talks about how Maui, who's like one of the great Polynesian heroes, he has to go up against Mahuika, who's the guardian of fire, and it's from Mahuika that he wrings the treasure of fire and bestows it back onto humanity. So now we have Africa and Native Americans and ancient Greek and Polynesian islands, right? And again, these are some of the most ancient stories that are being told. And another important thing to include here is we can pretty much be sure, right, that none of these cultures had crosstalk, or what Carl Jung calls cross-pollination. And basically, if they did, we'd have to like revise everything we know about world history. It's like these are literally popping up in opposite sides of the world in some of the most ancient times, and you have the same fundamental story. That's what's so fascinating and crazy about it. And one of the things that has interested me a lot lately is the relationship between mythology and science. So like, I'm just gonna I could keep, right, if this interests you, check out the book. Like at a certain point, like I said, it's moot to just give examples, but in this case, right, this one's interesting because it brings in science and technology, like Joseph Campbell talks about. The cosmic egg myth is a creation myth that's found in the Chinese, the Finnish, the Japanese, the Buddhist, the ancient Greek. It's one of the most prevalent mythologies around the world, the most prevalent creation story too. And what it involves is basically, in the beginning there is an egg, right, an egg of some sort, and what happens is the egg hatches, and from the hatching of this egg is the creation of all things. So I'm not going to go through specific examples, but I just want to point out that that's very similar to basically the modern scientific view of the Big Bang. The Big Bang is essentially a cosmic egg myth, because what you have is, in the beginning, right, in the Big Bang there's a point, right? It's a point with infinite density and infinite energy, and however you want to think about it. But that's fundamentally, right, the egg. And the Big Bang takes place, the explosion, the creation of the universe, however that happened, right, is the egg hatching. And in fact, the egg is still hatching. Right, but this is the creation of all things. This is the creation of the universe. Literally, the Big Bang is completely analogous to the cosmic egg myth. And of course, the Big Bang has experimental evidence to back it and empirical observations, right? It's got modern science, microwave radiation, measuring how fast galaxies are accelerating, right? They got all that good stuff, but still fundamentally, I believe it is a sort of creation myth, because no matter how much science you throw at it, you will never be able to explain that fundamental beginning. It's one of the fundamental mysteries of all existence, right? And science, while it can sort of articulate the physical terms in which all that happens, it still cannot explain the ultimate source. And again, there's tons of examples of this. Like literally, here, just another sort of fun one is the idea of, you know, Jesus Christ being crucified on the Holy Rood, which is known as like the tree of redemption, right? Jesus being this world savior figure. Hold up. Hitting the doobie for Jesus, that's facts. But you have Jesus Christ, like I said, who's crucified on the Holy Rood, the tree of redemption, which is like the world tree. And then you have a very similar figure in the Buddha, who is also a world savior figure related to enlightenment. And he has his moment. There's this sort of crazy sequence that happens, but it all takes place under the Bo tree, which is known as the tree of enlightenment. So you have these two world savior figures at the world tree motif, having like their image of redemption of the entire world. And then on top of that, there's also Odin in the Norse mythology, where he basically, in a quest for like worldly enlightenment, he goes down to the world tree of Yggdrasil. He takes out his left eye and hangs himself upside down from the tree for 9 days to achieve more knowledge, and again, that form of enlightenment. So those, you know, just like once you start noticing this stuff, it really does pop up everywhere. Like hopefully I'm sure I will talk about this stuff more, but the point of my bringing up all those examples is to point out that you have these same remarkably similar stories, like down to some crazy level of detail, being told all around the world, where we can be quite sure that there's been no element of cross-pollination, no cross-cultural talk. We're just, as he says, spontaneously converging upon these stories on our own. And then this can lead us now actually to the part of the relation of mythology and the unconscious, and also dreams, and again, the psychoanalytic sort of interpretation of what mythology actually is. But again, Joseph Campbell thinks that this stuff, and Carl Jung, is happening at the level of the unconscious. Joseph Campbell says, consciousness can no more foretell or even predict an effective symbol than it can predict basically tonight's dreams, right? The whole thing is being worked out at another level. And what that level ends up being is sort of like again, the unconscious at the individual level with dreams, but then at the collective unconscious, like how we see with mythology. And the whole, hold up, Dewey mayonnaise, what is that? Matter of fact, let me get a coffee break. Let's call that a cliffhanger. But so I'm actually going to bring in another text at this point, which is Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, to talk about, because one of the things that both of these figures talk about is the relationship, again, and the parallels in the same way that I've been talking about, but between all these different mythologies and individual dreams. So Carl Jung talks about how he had basically a patient come to him. Well, but it was like this father who was coming on behalf of his 8-year-old daughter, who basically for Christmas or something gifted him, or for his birthday, gifted him her dream journal, right? And again, she's an 8-year-old, so we can be pretty sure just off the rip that she's not familiar with the sophisticated symbols of the world religions, right? She's an 8-year-old. And she's spontaneously, in the same way that the mythologies appear spontaneously dreaming these sorts of dreams. So here's one of the examples Carl Jung gives. There's the evil animal, a snake-like monster with many horns, kills and devours all other animals. But God comes from the four corners and gives rebirth to all the dead animals. So the cycle of death and rebirth is, of course, one of the most common mythological motifs. For one, it's represented by the Ouroboros, which is the snake eating its own tail, which is supposed to represent the endless cycle of life and death. And essentially, it's key to the whole thing is that it is from death that comes life, right? So you have this evil animal, which, by the way, a snake-like monster with many horns, the idea of the serpentine sort of demon, or the horned demon, these are features that pop up all over the world when they're describing like their own demons and deities and things like that. But yeah, I mean, even the flood myth, I think, is a good example. It is from death that comes life, right? It is the cycle of death and rebirth. So, okay, here's another one. An ascent into heaven where pagan dances are being celebrated, and a descent into hell where angels are doing good deeds. So basically, like, pagan dances are supposed to be, as I kind of understand it, sacrilegious and blasphemous. So you have like these sort of heretical dances taking, you can just picture them weird, happening by a firelight, right, up in heaven. But then in heaven you have angels doing good deeds. And this to me is fundamentally, the first thing that comes to mind is yin and yang, right? You have the complete unity of the circle, and there's two halves, like the light and the dark, but contained within the light is also the dark, and vice versa. The two are really defined in terms of each other. And I'm actually reading Soseki right now. Well, I just finished The Three-Cornered World, and he has this line where basically, like, just as light and darkness are opposites, so too anytime something is shown in the sunlight, it must cast a shadow. So like that, I don't know, that whole idea of this duality seems to come to mind for me. But again, we're talking about dreams here. This is coming from this little girl's dreams. So a drop of water is seen as it appears when looked at through a microscope. The girls see that the drop is full of tree branches. This portrays the origin of the world. So my interpretation of this one is essentially that, like, that just like the complexity of life, like even contained within the tiniest little droplet of water can be this whole universe. And it's related to that whole alchemical, mystical idea of as above, so below. The idea that you find the same fundamental patterns at all scales of the universe. And this is even true psychologically. Like, this is what Plato talks about with the microcosm and the macrocosm. Like, the individual self is a representation of the larger society. But even just with the idea of like the tiny drop, like, it's kind of a silly example, but like Horton Hears a Who that's Dr. Seuss, right? Yeah, surely. But on the tiniest little speck of dust on this daffodil is contained like this whole universe. And there's relationships between science and technology as well. Again, like, so the things that come to mind to me mathematically are like the Fibonacci ratio, which is like this sort of perfect, well, I won't get into the details, but it's this pattern that's found again at all scales of the universe. And there's also this idea in math of the Mandelbrot set, and I'll try and put something up here, but it ends up being like this crazy beautiful, I think it's undeniable. This would be an interesting question, like, can math representations be beautiful? I think it's fundamentally beautiful. And then even in the tiniest little scope of it, like, you can just literally infinitely dive into it. It's a fractal, and so it has like these same patterns, but it's literally within it a whole sort of, like, again, a universe. So okay, let's keep going. A bad boy has a clod of earth and throws bits of it at everyone who passes. In this way, all the passersby become bad. So the whole idea right there of corruption, right? Well, so for one, even the clod of earth, that part's crazy, because that, like, in the Native American stuff that I've been reading, that's oftentimes how humanity is formed, from like clods of earth or like blood clots. And Deucalion and his wife, what they end up doing is they throw rocks, and as the rocks hit the earth, Just got an Outlook notification. But as the rocks hit the earth, they become human beings, and we know that Adam in the Christian God, in the Christian version, he's created of dust, right? So just right off the bat, the clod of earth theme, I'm just picking him out. As I see him. A bad boy throws bits of it. In this way, all passersby become bad. This is also like Adam and Eve eating the tree, the fruit of the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, which introduces sin. And that's the same thing as the ancient Greek version of Pandora's box. It's the opening of that box. Isn't it funny that they both involve like this curiosity? Like God's like, don't eat the apple, but it's also knowledge. Like that is fundamentally what it is to be human. So like obviously we're gonna want it. Same thing with Pandora's box. And so just right off the bat. Okay, last one. A drunken woman falls into the water and comes out renewed and sober. That literally is a baptism when you think about it. And it's this idea also of redemption and purging, right? A drunk woman falls into the water, comes out renewed and sober. So yeah, but like I said, it feels like we've been talking about myths the whole time, but those were dreams. And so the idea there that Joseph Campbell talks about is that the unconscious has like truly generative powers, right? At the individual level with dreams, and at the collective level of myth. And in fact, he has Fireline. He says, myth is the depersonalized dream. Dream is the personalized myth. So bro's cooking with that one. And then hold up, let's take a coffee break. And now that my hands are free, let me spark her back up. So Joseph Campbell makes a big point to talk about and Carl Jung, and just like this whole thing about the relationship too between dreams and again, like the relationship between modern science. And what happens is there's tons of examples, and again, some of these I'm just pulling from my own experience, but there's there's a famous mathematician or chemist or something, I think it's a chemist rather, named Kekule. And what I'm trying to say here is Cormac McCarthy did this whole essay called the Kekule problem, and it's very much about these ideas. So and it's weird because I that's like the first and only essay I've seen by Cormac McCarthy, and it's an absolute banger, which all this stuff definitely feeds into the interpretation of Cormac McCarthy's writing, definitely. But in the paper, and also just like the actual event, is what happens is there's this chemist who essentially, he's been trying to figure out the molecular structure of benzene, and eventually one day in his sleep, like I think he's working on this for several weeks if not longer, and he goes to sleep and he dreams of all things, again, something we've already talked about, the Ouroboros. Hold up before this goes out, the Ouroboros. And it's in that moment he has this insight. Benzene is in fact ring-like, right? And he wakes up, instantly realizes it, and it's the ring-like structure of benzene that actually allows for it to like interact with these other carbon molecules, I believe it was. So that's like the Kekule problem. You have also Dmitri Mendeleev, right? And he's the one who created the periodic table. And if I'm not mistaken, he was working on this for years. And the legend has it that one day after a very long day of working, he went to sleep, and it basically occurred to him in his dream that it should be organized by atomic weight. And so that's the same structure that we now follow today, and that's that occurred in a dream. And there's tons of mathematicians and physicists who say they get a proof for something, or like this fundamental insight, they have it in dreams and they sort of wake up and scribble it down. So it is this, you could argue, deeper source. And I think this is where I think people like Jung and Freud were actually onto something, the relation of the unconscious, and just to all these different things, right? Myth and dreams, and even, again, science and technology. And that becomes particularly interesting too, and one of the things that both of these people, like Jung and Joseph Campbell, one of the things they stress, and which is facts, is the role of mythology in the modern world. And basically how since industrialization and the scientific method, that's what Joseph Campbell says, since the introduction of those things, we've slowly abandoned all the traditions and practices and rituals which for generations before us had otherwise guided the people into what are, again, fundamentally universally experienced fundamental transitions, rites of passage, and psychological transformations, right? We no longer have those rituals which have informed these communities for generations. And he says, so today, all of those things we must face alone. And he points out Nietzsche's Zarathustra, who says, dead are all the gods, right? We in a modern world feel like mythology is something we don't actually take seriously. It's something we've sort of outgrown. And we'll talk about the implications of that. But so one of the things they both mentioned is like, imagine living in a culture who actually does embrace mythology. Joseph Campbell says, for a culture that does, every phase of human existence is made alive with symbolic suggestion. And what he talks about in examples that both of these figures give is the idea of Navajo architecture originally being formed literally like a mandala. So they built their actual architecture of their cities symbolically, where the temple would be in the center of the square, right? And you have it, branching off mandala-like in that respect. And even just like recently, like this stuff, like, so, and again, you can imagine how someone who lives like that might actually be impacted in a way that is psychologically transformative. And I was thinking about this recently too when I visited Machu Picchu, and because it's like, to get there, it's like this whole 6+ mile hike, like that you were hiking all day, and it's up these steps, you're going up and deep into this mountain range, but then you get to the summit and it's like literally like this crazy beautiful ruins that's built on it. It's like, could you imagine actually living there? Like, they're being surrounded in nature like this, right? And there's no pollution of the modern, like light pollution or real pollution for that matter, of the modern world. Like, you know, when it's nighttime, you could see the whole Milky Way, like sleeping under like that, the heavens basically just bestowed upon you, living on, like, there's no way that would not affect you psychologically. And then even just recently, I was at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and there were like masks, and I don't really pay attention to masks really a whole lot, but something about these just, I don't know, for whatever reason, struck me as just being so intricate and complex, and like they really are works of art in themselves, and like they're the physical things. And it's just like, could you imagine, for instance, Machu Picchu and donning this mask and partaking in a ritual that like your ancestors for generations have been practicing, and like almost, again, in a sort of like, you could imagine like a rite of passage. I mean, we have these too. This is like the quinceañera, this is the bat mitzvah, this is graduation. Those are all rituals, coming of age rituals. But again, when we don't embrace a world of spirituality and mythology, that's the kind of stuff that we miss out on. Because Cicero, in fact, of all people, right? Cicero, who's like this Roman statesly rhetorician, stoic big head, he talks about participating in the Eleusinian mysteries, which I believe they practiced both in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And again, it involves like this really long hike into nature, and then there's this ritual that takes place. But Cicero talks about how it was literally, he says, life-changing, right? And it woke in him a spiritual awakening. And basically, again, what do we do when we, in a society, when we never have that awakening, right? We never have those experiences or those stories or those traditions to actually get us to go through that. For Cicero, going on these Eleusinian mysteries was a genuinely life-changing experience. And so what happens when we don't have our own, right, Eleusinian mysteries, when we don't have our own rituals and traditions, we are left without spiritual aid. And what both of these figures talk about, and which is just, I think most people can agree, is probably since industrialization, the rise in technology, there's been increasing rates of neuroticism and depression and anxiety and panic attacks and loneliness and all these different things, right? That could very well be due psychologically because we're not getting this whole other, and that's the thing, fundamental aspect of ourselves. Like the spiritual is arguably, you know, what defines mankind, and just the need for community. And again, just the notion of these rituals and these rites of passage that all, as the myths show, that all humans sort of experience. And the reason we even deny it as a society is because I think, and this is going to be true of a lot of people essentially, is that what the problem with mythology is when people take it literally and they understand it to be like actual history or biography or science, when really this is about, you know, human psychology. That's what mythology is ultimately about. But, you know, when you believe, for instance, in a, you know, for something like, for instance, like a literal resurrection, or you believe the world was literally an egg, right? And this is the idea, you know, this is where I might lose some people, is what Joseph Campbell says is the problem of religion is they take the myths too literally. And, you know, as I've just shown, like all the religions of the world end up converging on these same stories, and yet what happens is you have millions of people dying in wars over what end up being logistical details, which are essentially like besides the point, right? These are meant to be understood symbolically. And he even says the job of the theologian is to keep his symbols translucent enough so that he does not block the very light he is supposed to convey. Symbols are vehicles of communication. They should not be mistaken for the final term of their reference, which really ultimately is the fundamental mystery of existence, like the creation of the universe, the creation of life and good and evil, all of these principles, and just the creation of like how you get something from nothing. That all fundamentally is what's referred to as the transcendent, which is related to Buddhist concept, mystical concepts. It's that which is beyond conception, is beyond language, beyond all intellect, right? Is the ultimate transcendent, imperishable source. And it's that same source which is behind the construction of the atom and which controls the orbit of stars, right? It's just this universal force which is ultimately, whose source is ultimately unknown, and that is the mystery of existence. So again, I'll close this out here with a line that he brings up in the Vedas, where he says, "Truth is one, the sages call it by many names." And obviously, like, hopefully we've kind of got a better idea of like what mythology actually is and how like why it's actually so fascinating. And again, the psychoanalytic, because I come from a psychology background, I have a degree in psychology, so this, when you read myths almost as psychoanalysis, it's just, that idea is fascinating. The relation with science and technology, all of it, I love it. And this is why I've just been like, you know, pretty into this stuff for a little bit. So if you have your own thoughts, comments, anything, let me know in the comments. I will say, just real quick, since this was a book review, the critiques for this book, at times it can sort of drag on and be almost like academic, but not really. This is me nitpicking, right? At times too, it can be over-interpretive. He relies heavily on Freud and the whole infant mother-father complex, which honestly at times I find kind of convincing, but you know, you can take that or leave it. Some would say he's too formulaic in giving, like, you know, because ultimately he talks about the hero's journey in all its different forms, which is one of the most popular myths, and it always involves, right, like this this departure and this initiation and this return. And anyway, he outlines kind of in detail all the different phases of that. So it could be too overly formulaic, but for me, this book is A to A plus. Realistically, for someone else, I don't know. It kind of depends on your, if you are interested in this, I think you'll love it, but we'll say, like, I think B plus, A minus is a good average rating if you really go through and read this book. So again, let me know if you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, questions, comments, concerns. Thank you for watching Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews.